All right, hello everyone. Welcome back. This is World War II, Part 2. We're all going to go through this presentation per normal, per usual. But I'm first going to show you a timeline. So I'm going to pick up the camera and show you a timeline of the war. Because today we're going to go through a lot of battles and a lot of important events and a lot of information, a lot of people. And so I want to just go through this just to lay it all out first. And then we'll go through all the details, all the information, okay? So first thing, I want to start up at the top with the quarantine speech. Remember that we learned about that one in the last lesson. And what that does is it stops trade with the Axis powers, okay? So let's jump down here real quick. We need to establish who the allies are, aka kind of the good guys. Those are US, England, France, Soviet Union, and China. Soviet Union, aka Russia. Remember that these two are allies, the Soviet Union and the US, because later we're going to be enemies, and that's going to be a big, huge deal, but don't worry about that right now. And then the Axis powers, aka the bad guys, that is Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan, okay? So keep that in mind as we go through this. All right, so first and most important event that really kicks off World War II, and I should write it on here actually, September 1st, 1939, the Nazis invade Poland. That really starts what we consider to be actual World War II historically. Now, Japan had invaded China in the middle of the 1930s, and that was a situation that the U.S. was keeping its eye on because Japan committed some war crimes in China in the 1930s. Unfortunately, we don't really have time to go over those, but we do need to go over this. So, when this happens, when the Nazis invade Poland, England and France, who are in Europe, declare war on the Nazis 2 days later because they see this as an act of aggression and they see the Nazis building their empire and they decide they need to stop it. Unfortunately, the Nazis were very, very powerful, and in June of 1940, France fell to the Nazis. So it's kind of a tough situation we got going on here, okay? In 1941, in January, Roosevelt gives his Four Freedoms speech, in which he doesn't directly call out the Nazis or anything like that, but he talks about the freedoms of religion and speech and the freedom from want and fear. And what it shows is that the U.S. is keeping an eye on what's going on in the world, and, you know, they're kind of... It's not a threat, but it's more of like, hey, we're going to defend these things around the world eventually. And then in March of 1941, the U.S. begins the Lend-Lease Act, which, remember, is weapons for the Allies. And then in August of 1941, the Atlantic Charter begins the friendship between the U.S. and the Allies. Remember, that's when Churchill and FDR sit down, shake hands, and they discuss how they're going to be friends and what they're going to do after the war. Then if you look down at the bottom, December of 1941, that's when Japan attacks the U.S. base at Pearl Harbor. We're going to go over all the reasons why that happened here in just a little bit, so I'm just going to leave that there. And then notice 4 days later, the U.S. and Axis powers declare war on each other. The United States actually declared war on Japan on December 8th, and it may even been the evening of the 7th. I want to say it was the 8th, though. But then Germany on December 11th declares war on the U.S. and U.S. says, okay, Germany, let's do this thing, okay? So from there are two wars going on that you really need to know about. World War I has a Pacific theater and a European theater. The Pacific theater is versus Japan. The European theater is versus the Nazis and Italy, okay? Now, in the Pacific, there are a few very important battles, all right? So let's go over the Pacific battles first. First is going to be June of 1942, the Battle of Midway. It's actually the Battle of Midway Island. It's right in the middle of the Pacific, and we're going to talk about it later, but that's a turning point in the war because the U.S. wins a major victory here, okay? We don't actually talk about this one, but this is very important. The Nazis also tried to invade the Soviet Union, and they were defeated at the Battle of Stalingrad, and that's a turning point in the war, okay? So when the Nazis are defeated at Stalingrad in the Soviet Union, they are forced to push back and fall back into Europe, where they will soon be facing the Allied invasion known as D-Day. This is the largest military invasion in all of history. And we'll see how it plays a major, major turning point in the war later in the PowerPoint. All right, then we're going back over to the Pacific Theater. In February 1945, the U.S. wins the Battle of Iwo Jima, and it continues this island-hopping campaign. They're hopping from island to island, so they were in the Battle of Midway. Then they're over here in Iwo Jima, and then they're able to move on to Okinawa, and they win a major battle there, but it's a big problem because lots and lots of casualties. So the U.S. realizes that, hey, if we actually get on the main island of Japan, we're going to have some major problems, which leads us to a decision to drop the atomic bombs. And we're going to talk about that later. But the two cities you need to know are Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Let's jump back up to Europe. In the spring of 1945, we went over this last week, the Holocaust survivors were liberated. And then in May of 1945, May 8th, 1945, we get something called VE Day, which is the Victory in Europe Day. So May 8th, 1945, the war is over in Europe. Then 2 months later, roughly 2-3 months later, Japan surrenders, known as VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day, okay? So the war ends in 1945. Yay, the U.S. wins, the Allies win. But without the U.S., the Allies would not have won. The U.S. definitely played a major role, and we're going to talk about that. Two things I left off because they really wouldn't fit. February and July of 1945, we have two big meetings. One is called the Yalta Conference, and the other is called the Potsdam Conference. Those happen in Europe among the big leaders of the Allied powers. And basically what they decide is what they're going to do after the war is over. Because by early 1945, it was clear that the U.S. and the Allies were going to win. Okay? So that's all that is for that timeline. If you need a picture of that or anything, let me know. Or you could take a screenshot if you're watching on your phone. So there's that little timeline of World War II. It's not totally complete. It's definitely missing a lot of important information, but I hit the high points that we have to know. So speaking of the high points that we have to know, let's jump back over here. Let me get set up. Hopefully this thing will cooperate. Ooh, looks pretty good. Let me get a swig of water and then we'll jump right in, all right? Sweet! Hope everybody's doing okay. Hope this looks good, that you can see it. And we're gonna rock and roll. Now we are gonna go over a ton of information in this one, but I'm gonna hopefully try to keep it pretty quick because the information is pretty simple. We gotta go through why the U.S. gets involved in World War II. It's really pretty easy. It's a lot easier than World War I. And then from there, we're gonna go into some important people, some important battles, some important fighting units, some combat units and people in America. Then we got to talk about the atomic bombs, unfortunately, and then from there, what happens after the war towards the end, okay? Remember to pause as you need to. This is probably going to be about an hour, just so you know, and but you can watch it in phases. You don't have to watch it all at once. Email me if you need any help, and visit my website to download the PowerPoints. Ready? Here we go. So first thing, learning about the reasons for American entry into World War II. All right, as we talked about earlier, England and France were part of the Allies, and the U.S. was already helping them out with the Lend-Lease Act. If you remember, we were already sending military equipment, as in weapons, oil, and food, over to the Allies because they needed help fighting against Germany. Remember, Germany is the antithesis, the opposite of the U.S. Germany was a fascist country, and the U.S. is a democracy. So there was some, the U.S. obviously is going to support their old friends, England and France. Now, Germany was also being very aggressive, and so the U.S. is kind of seeing this, and they're saying, hey, we're going to have to jump in. So guess what? The Germans were using submarines again. They're called U-boats, Unterseeboats, and probably didn't pronounce that right, but it's okay. And they actually made it all the way to the coast of Virginia. Now, German submarines never, as far as I know, I think there might be one story of them actually firing on American beaches, but they were seen as close to our shores as off the coast of Virginia, which is pretty crazy. So Germany was getting wild with their submarines again. Oh, Germany. Remember, Germany is building an empire in Europe. Remember, they invaded Poland in 1939 and went over this. So Germany's really already declared war in Europe, and the U.S. is like, oh man, we're going to have to jump in. And then finally, the attack on Pearl Harbor, along with Japan. Japan was building an empire, and they did some really bad things in China. Unfortunately, we can't go through them. It's too long. But they did some really bad things in China. If you're interested, email me and I can tell you some more about it. And then, of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor, which we're going to go into, okay? So that really breaks it down right here. This is a very good little diagram. So there you have it there, okay? So very simple. Ta-da! All right. Now, if you recall, we already talked about the quarantine speech, okay? Quarantine speech. Let me write that down again, because this goes into this. So the quarantine speech, what it did is it ended trade with aggressive nations. Ends trade. And we call this an embargo. Okay? And the United States had placed an embargo on Japan because of its actions in China. And Japan sees this as a direct act of aggression from the United States. They say, hey, you didn't trade with us, that shows you're being hostile. And you know what? If you're going to be hostile to us, we're going to be really hostile to you. And so in December of 1941, and hopefully you've probably heard about this before, but if not, Japan attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was a major, major disaster for America, a major catastrophe, really, and it's a complete act of aggression by Japan. It did destroy most of the naval base there. It sank 5 battleships. Now, I don't know if you know what a battleship is, but it's a very, very massive, very, very expensive piece of equipment. So when it says they destroyed 5 battleships, that is a really big deal that Japan did this, because this is a major, major piece of equipment. You can literally sail a battleship around the world and wage almost an entire war off of just a couple of battleships. And we're going to talk about battleships being sunk later with some of the other battles, okay? Now, a lot of Americans died, 2,400 Americans and 1,100 wounded. Really, really dark day in U.S. military history, and this is what pushes the United States to declare war on Japan, okay? So that happens on December 8th, 1941. I highly recommend you look up some YouTube videos about this. I can't show you any on here because this is my YouTube video and it would be some kind of copyright thing, but look some more information up on that because it's a very interesting and very sad thing. There have been a lot of movies made about it. All right, so there's some images. Okay. Now, like I said, there's a couple of reasons for this, and it goes back to that quarantine speech. Remember, the U.S. said, hey, we're not trading with you as you are being aggressive to China. Now, Japan is also really trying to show off to the rest of the world. Japan is saying, hey, we're going to attack the most powerful country on earth, because even though the United States was still kind of suffering from the Depression and everything, we were the most powerful country on earth, and Japan is really trying to show, hey, we can do something big. Now, here's the thing. They did do something big here at Pearl Harbor, okay? But Pearl Harbor is in Hawaii, and it's not on the mainland U.S., and I'm not taking away from the disaster at Pearl Harbor or away from the people who lost their lives. But this is not like Japan attacking New York City or Washington, D.C. and killing tons and tons of civilians and making a huge statement. The U.S. sees this, and the U.S. says, okay, Japan, you want to do something? And the U.S. is really going to go after Japan here, okay? Now, it is kind of a small thing in comparison, and I'm not meaning to say that at all. It's definitely a horrible, horrible thing that Pearl Harbor happened. But what they did, and this is a quote from a famous speech, is that Japan awoke a sleeping giant in the United States. Japan underestimated our ability to fight a big war, and the U.S. really turns on their war machine. We're going to talk about all the war production in the next video, part 3. The U.S. really gets going, and this is a big mistake on Japan's part, okay? That's the point, all right? So there you go. Japan is acting out after the U.S. placed embargoes on their trade, okay? And then 3 days later, so U.S. declares war on Japan on December 8th, and then 3 days later, Germany gets way too excited, and they're like, yes! Hitler gets too excited. He gets so stoked about Japan attacking America, and he hates America because America has a lot of different people, and remember, Hitler is an ultimate racist, okay? And also, Hitler did the same thing. He underestimated our ability to operate in a war, okay? So when this happens, I mean, the United States probably saw this coming, and so they immediately declare war as well. So now World War II is on. December 11th, 1941 is when the U.S. is really fully in this thing, okay? All right. Ta-da! All right. So, what are 4 reasons why the U.S. entered World War II? So first one, remember, it goes back to World War I even. German use of submarine warfare. Remember, the Germans were getting wild again. German use of submarines. Okay. German and Japanese imperialism. And from there, we have the attack on Pearl Harbor. And let me check something real quick. Sorry. I had a little brain fart and couldn't remember. We were already basically in it. The Lend-Lease Act. There we go. Perfect. Cool. So, why did Japan attack the U.S. at Pearl Harbor? There's a few reasons. Okay. U.S. had put a trade embargo, or here, we'll just say stop trading. U.S. had stopped trading with Japan. Cut off their oil. And then also remember, Japan is trying to show off. So Japan is trying to show off their strength. All right. 3 effects of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The U.S. declares war on Japan. And this is a simple answer. The U.S. declares war on Japan. Japan declares war, or excuse me, well that was actually Japan declaring war earlier. Germany declares war. Sorry y'all, it took me a long time to draw that timeline. My brain's frying already. Here we go. Germany declares war on the U.S. And U.S. declares war on Germany. So that's the third. Yeah, this answer is really simple. A lot of information with World War II. See how that looks. It looks great. All right, remember to pause it if you need to. And we're going to keep rocking and rolling. There you have it. All right, moving right along. All right, now, so we're going to go through a bunch of world leaders, and they're going to be all listed out in your notes, so you've got all the information. It's a lot of them, but you'll be all right. So here we go. First one, Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is probably the most famous character from World War II because he gives the very famous speech, never, never, never give up. You know, you've heard that. Hopefully you've heard that. If not, look it up. It's a great speech. And he's an expert leader. He was a military strategist. He was in the military before. Winston Churchill dedicated his whole life to defeating fascism and defeating Nazism. He's later going to be part of the Cold War and help out the U.S. against the Soviet Union. And he, like I said, made it his whole life. He lived in the war room in England in the government. Literally, basically didn't sleep. He would sleep for a couple hours at a time and then just continue working on stuff about the war. So he made it his whole passion, his whole thing to win the war against Nazis. And thankfully it worked out. Very good. Good job, Winston Churchill. See you later. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower is important because he's the most important American military leader. He's leader of the Allied forces in North Africa. They did fight in Africa as well. It was part of the colonial war. We don't really learn about it in these standards, so don't worry about it. If you're interested, email me and we can discuss. But he's leader of the Allied forces in North Africa as well as in Western Europe. And he is going to be a part of D-Day. Later, he's going to be commander of NATO, which is a big alliance after the war. And then he's president from 1953 to 1961. We'll actually revisit Eisenhower in a couple weeks when we go over the 1950s. But Eisenhower, remember, Allied military general in Europe. Oh, no, we don't want to see him. Adolf Hitler. We've already learned about him, but just some more information about him. He is one of the most powerful dictators of the 1900s, probably the most infamous person in history. He was the Führer, that's what you call the leader of Germany, Führer. From 1933 to 45, he supposedly killed himself at the end of the war. There's a big conspiracy that he may escape to South America. Either way, he'd be like 120 if he was still alive now, so he's probably dead. He also was solely responsible for the Holocaust, in which tens of millions of people, the number is somewhere between 7 million and like 15 million. Nobody knows exactly how many because he killed so many people. Terrible, terrible, terrible person, probably one of the worst in all of human history. And he is pretty much solely responsible for causing World War II. All right? All right. MacArthur, so we're switching gears again with his corncob pipe. There he is. MacArthur, he's an American general. He's the leader in the Pacific, and he's also going to oversee the military occupation of post-war Japan and Korea. We'll get to the Korean War in a couple weeks. And he's also a leader of the United Nations during the Korean War. MacArthur's a tough guy and kind of made a few mistakes later in his career, so he's not as well revered in history. However, he did lead the brilliant island hopping campaign in the Japanese theater, the Pacific theater, so he is important. So there you go. George C. Marshall. Marshall is a guy who he runs things at home, helps out the military, expanded the size of the military. He's a military strategist on how to win this war overall. Because if you've got two theaters of war, you're going to need a guy to kind of mediate between and say, hey, the military needs this on this side, the military needs that on that side. He helps work out D-Day, and then later he's going to come up with something called the Marshall Plan. And we're going to talk about the Marshall Plan. A lot of these people, we're just getting introduced to them, but we'll learn about the Marshall Plan later. It has to do with the economic plan for Europe after the war. Okay, so that's Marshall. Mussolini, who we already know, the original fascist, and he is a terrible person, friend and ally of Hitler. He's a member of the Axis powers. He was murdered in 1945 by some Italian people when the war was starting to go really bad in 1945 for the Axis. He tried to go run away into hiding, but he got caught. He was killed. And for 3 days, they hung his body upside down in Milan for people to go see it and spit on it. So Mussolini, definitely not loved in history. Bad, bad guy. All right. Then we go on to Roosevelt, a good guy here. Very good guy he's kind of like his relative Teddy, where he's good for certain parts of America, bad for others. But he did get us through the Great Depression with his policies, remember the New Deal, and then World War II. We're going to talk later next week about how he really got the American economy going. He made it a big priority to win against Nazism, so he's good buddies with Churchill. He won 4 terms as president, and we get term limits after him because people really liked him. He did such a good job. But he worked so hard, and it literally, if you read history books about this man, it says he worked himself pretty much to death. He had a brain hemorrhage in 1945, all right? So FDR, big, big, important president in American history, and there he is right there, okay? Oh no, another bad one, Stalin. Stalin was dictator of the Soviet Union, aka the USSR. It's 2 different names for the same thing. You can just call it Russia if you want to. But from 1929 to 1953, now remember, even though Stalin was a really, really bad guy, he did transform the Soviet Union into a world superpower. Huge military, huge amount of industry there. But remember, he was a full totalitarian, very, very bad guy. Now, as far as the war goes, he's a very complicated character because he does, he makes his country into a superpower, and he successfully fought off the Nazis. The Nazis tried to invade the Soviet Union, which was really a big mistake on their part because they tried to do it in the wintertime. But Stalin successfully fights off a Nazi invasion, but later we're going to see, and we're going to learn a lot more about him too, later we're going to see that U.S. just can't get along with this guy because he is a communist, okay? He did expand communism very, very far, all over pretty much Southeast Asia and into Eastern Europe. Very strong leader, very bad guy, did some good things, but did a whole lot of bad things, okay? All right. And a new one, Hideki Tojo. Hideki Tojo was prime minister and also military general of Japan, so he's kind of almost like a dictator for Japan. Under him, Japan invaded China in the 1930s to try to build an empire. And then Tojo later sees Germany and Italy doing kind of the same thing, and they're like, sweet, we can all be evil friends, so it's like an evil trio. And then later he supervises the attack on Pearl Harbor, okay? He was captured at the end of the war. He went on trial for crimes against humanity, and he was hanged in 1948, okay? There you go. We went through those fast, but a lot of these guys, like I said, including another one, Mr. Truman here, President Truman, we're going to learn a lot about them later. So Truman, he is FDR's vice president. So when FDR dies in 1945, boom, he takes over. Truman is the one who's kind of responsible for making the decision to use the atomic bomb. That's kind of why we remember him. We're going to learn more about him later with the Korean War. He didn't really do that good of a job with it, and so he did not get, in 1953, he didn't run for re-election. So he's got a mixed bag of history. He does some good things, but of course the atomic bomb is so controversial that a lot of people feel either one way or the other about him. But he was president after FDR dies and finishes out the war. And we're going to talk a lot more about him later. All right, cool. So an intro. All right, so what are the roles of Churchill, FDR, and Truman during the war? So Churchill, he is Prime Minister of England, which is kind of similar to a president in the United States. Prime Minister of England. And then FDR, U.S. President. Then we'll say he died in 1945. And then Truman, U.S. President after FDR. Very good. Eisenhower, MacArthur, and George Marshall during the war. He is the Allied leader in Europe. 2 theaters of war, Europe and Pacific. And MacArthur, Allied leader in the Pacific. And Marshall, he is a general. He's General George C. Marshall, but what we're going to call him is kind of like American military coordinator. He kind of figures out, like, we'll say American military strategist. He is a general, but he's going to put, this together, these two things together, and figure out how to win the war totally. And then these guys, so fascist dictators. Totalitarians, and really, this guy too. So they're all fascist dictators and totalitarian rulers. If you need to know it, Mussolini's Italy, Hitler is Nazi Germany, Stalin is the Soviet Union, but remember they were friends with us, which is weird, but that's part of the Allies. And then Hideki Tojo. Now, Hitler and Stalin actually were friends, but Hitler changed his mind and invaded Russia anyway. So Stalin's like, nah, we ain't friends anymore, and then it's when he becomes friends with the Allies. Tojo is Japan. Okay? Cool. Let's see how we're doing on time. I'm trying to go a little quicker today. I think we're good to go. All right. Sweet. All right. Now we get to the Pacific and European theaters. Now what you need to know is in the Pacific, we are fighting, so we're in the Pacific, we're fighting the Japanese. You need to remember that. And in Europe, we are fighting Nazis. Nazi Germany. Okay? So make sure you remember that. There's 2 parts of the war. They're going on at the same time, but they're in totally different parts of the war. This is actually really a world war. World War I is considered a world war because it's fought by just a lot of different countries from around the world, but it's kind of all in one place. World War II is all over the place. They're fighting in the Pacific, and they're fighting in Europe. They were also fighting in Africa, and we actually don't even get to go over that part. But if you want to talk about it, email me, and we can have a discussion. So we're going to go over some important battles. First one is the Battle of Midway, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Now you need to remember this too. These are all part of the U.S. island hopping campaign in the Pacific. And I'm going to show you on a map what that means. But island hopping literally means you fight island by island in order to get to the island of Japan. So island hopping in the Pacific. Okay? Big battles. Very bloody, especially this one. A lot of casualties. And then D-Day. D-Day is the only one that we talk about with the European theater. Unfortunately, the state of Tennessee doesn't provide too many battles for us to go over with Europe. It's just D-Day. But D-Day is extremely interesting, and there's a lot of really good movies about it, so I suggest watching that. These are all kind of turning points in war, in World War II, so they're very, very important. So let's rock and roll. All right, first one, the Battle of Midway. It is literally, and I'm going to show you on a map, right here in the middle between, it's called Midway because it's midway between USA and Japan, okay? So what the US is going to have to do, because it's so far away and the gigantic Pacific Ocean is separating, is they have to use the military, the Navy, and the Marines to hop from island to island. So off of Hawaii, they go down to here and they have to fight because Japan had taken over everything you see in red. So if we're eventually going to defeat Japan, we have to have our troops on the ground in Japan. Let me switch colors so that you can see there. So again, Hawaii is there, and we have to fight island to island to get to the mainland of Japan, and so we can have a full-scale invasion. Now we're going to talk later about what that means, but the first important victory that you need to know for the U.S. in World War II, as far as in the Pacific, is the Battle of Midway. And the reason why is because it shows that the U.S. Navy could actually come back from Pearl Harbor, and we destroyed 4 Japanese battleships, and this really shows that the U.S. is moving on and making moves. And Japan realizes that now they're going to have to start retreating and falling back, and the U.S. is going to start pushing forward more aggressively. Okay? So that's the Battle of Midway. Iwo Jima is another island. It's a very, very important battle between the U.S. Marines and the Imperial Army of Japan. And it is this famous image that we see that comes from Iwo Jima. This happens in 1945, so this is much later in the war. But it was some of the worst fighting in the war. It lasted for 5 weeks. And the Japanese, they follow the code of Bushido, the code of the samurai, which is you do not surrender. There is no surrender. So the Japanese soldiers there literally fought to the death. And that is something about the Pacific Theater that was a major, major problem, is that the Japanese were willing to go fully on. They're not going to quit. And so this is just going to be bloody, bloody, bloody warfare, okay? About 7,000 Marines were killed at Iwo Jima, so very, very terrible that this happened, but very good that the United States won, okay? All right, and lastly, the Battle of Okinawa. It's the last major battle of the Pacific in World War II, and it's one of the bloodiest. It's a huge invasion of the U.S. forces, and let's take a look on the map. What they're trying to do, they're finally getting close to mainland Japan, and so they're right here. They've come all the way, they fall all the way across the Pacific by island hopping, and it's a huge, huge battle. The Americans had about 49,000 casualties, while it's thought that about 110 Japanese soldiers were killed, and a lot of Okinawa civilians were killed too. So this is a very, very bad thing that this happened. However, this puts the U.S. right next to Japan so that they can launch a full-scale invasion, because now they control this entire area. They can launch a full-scale invasion. But when we get to the atomic bomb, we're going to talk about why the U.S. did not invade Japan, okay? So we have the Battle of Midway, which shows that the U.S. Navy cannot be messed with, and that we're going to be a big fighting force against Japan. Then we get Iwo Jima, which puts us a lot closer. Iwo Jima is really famous because of how bloody it was, and that the Marines did such a good job fighting there against such a powerful force. And then Okinawa, it puts us very, very close. It scales us, it gets us ready for a full-scale invasion of Japan, okay? All right, now we skip to the European theater. We pause on the Pacific because it's not over there. We're going to finish up there later. And we get to D-Day. D-Day is the name for the invasion of Normandy, the Allied invasion. It's got a code name called Operation Overlord, and it began on June 6, 1944. It is the largest full-scale invasion ever in history. 150,000 troops landed on a 50-mile stretch of beaches. It is some of the bloodiest fighting in the war. The U.S. suffered a major amount of casualties on the beaches of Normandy, and there's a lot of famous images from this. If you are interested, I highly suggest you looking up videos about D-Day because there's a lot going on there, okay? So what this does, The US and the Allies now fully have a massive amount of soldiers on the ground. It's just a huge amount of soldiers, a hyper influx of soldiers who are now able to fight against the Germans on the ground, because the German military had done a really, really good job keeping the Allies off the ground there. Most of the war in Europe was fought by air, but after this is when the Americans pushed towards Germany to take back over, okay? And what this signals is that this is the beginning of the end, because this happens in June of 1944, and the war in Europe is over in May of 1945. All right, so a lot of the famous images, you've probably seen these. If you ask your parents, and they allow you, because this movie is rated R and it's extremely graphic, but there's a great view of D-Day, a depiction of D-Day, sorry, I was writing, in a movie called Saving Private Ryan. And it shows what I've heard by historians and by veterans from watching interviews and things, is that it shows the most realistic depiction of the D-Day invasion. It is extremely graphic. If you need to ask your parents if you're going to watch Saving Private Ryan, but it's a great World War II movie. Okay. All right, so let's go over these, and we'll be good to go. Describe World War II in the Pacific. So we have the island hopping. To get to Japan. And it was extremely bloody. There you go. 3 specific battles. The first one is Midway. The other one you need to know is Iwo Jima. And the third is Okinawa. Okay. And then describe the importance of D-Day in the European theater. It's a massive Allied invasion. So when we say Allied, we're talking about US, England, France. Canadians were there. Massive Allied invasion of France, which led to the eventual defeat of the Nazis. So this is the turning point. This changes the game, and the Allies are going to win. Okay? So get down and down. Let's see how it looks. All right. We're doing pretty good on time. All right, remember, pause it if you need to. And we're going to keep rocking and rolling. All right, now, we're going to go through some special mentions in the war that the state of Tennessee wants you to know. And they're very unique. They have really cool stories. And I highly suggest, if you're interested in any of these, do some additional research. Look up some YouTube videos, because there's some really great stuff on this. Okay? All right, the Tuskegee Airmen, they are the first all-African-American military aviators in the U.S. Army Air Corps. So the U.S. Air Force isn't really a thing yet, but we have the U.S. Army Air Corps, which flew planes. They trained in Alabama, in the Tuskegee Army Airfield, and they did a lot of really good stuff in the war. They flew more than 15,000 individual raids, and they won a ton of awards. They were an impressive fighting force, were a key to victory. You can't say enough about these guys. Because they won all these good victories, they did so much for the American military, and they later helped lead to the eventual integration of the U.S. Armed Forces, okay? So, great group of guys, very cool part of history, and there's a couple movies about them, okay? All right, 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Who these guys are, they are Japanese Americans, and a lot of their parents are being held in internment camps in the U.S. And we haven't talked about that yet, and I'm not going there yet. We'll learn about it next week. It's super interesting and it's super depressing, unfortunately, okay? Now these guys, their families were being discriminated against at home. That's what I'm talking about right there. But they were one of the hardest fighting units for the American military. 21 members of the 442nd have received the Medal of Honor. These guys did a lot for the war, even though they were suffering from discrimination at home, okay? Very interesting. There's a lot of cool stuff on YouTube about them too, Okay. All right, 101st Airborne. They are a parachute infantry division, and now I know you're thinking, well, the military, they used parachutes for a long time. World War II is the first full-scale use of parachute soldiers in the war. And the 101st Airborne were created as a special unit during the war, and they carried out very, very many important roles, won a lot of important battles. They participated in the Battle of the Bulge, which was a major Allied turning point. And they also helped win an important battle called Operation Market Garden. These guys were dropped behind enemy lines on D-Day and then fought their way backwards to help the guys get off the beach that were coming up. So very important dudes. If you're interested in more learning about them, there's a great, and it's also, you need to ask your parents if you're going to watch this one. It's called Band of Brothers. I highly encourage you to watch that series because it goes into full detail about their story. All right, and it's all pretty much true. They interview veterans of the 101st Airborne the entire time. All right, and then the Navajo Code Talkers. They are Navajo Native Americans of they're Native Americans of the Navajo tribe, and they worked for the U.S. Marines, and they developed a code that was never broken by the Japanese. So they were able to communicate through code because you can't be talking about what your military is doing on the battlefield, because the enemy's going to be listening in. So these guys, they use their Navajo language to develop a code to help the U.S. military win in Japan, which is very cool. All right. And I know we're going really fast through these. Please look up more information about all those if you're interested, okay? Or you can email me and I can send you more information. That would probably be a great idea. The Tuskegee Airmen, African American. Aviators in U.S. Army Air Corps. So they're pilots. Oh my goodness, they're cops. Okay. 442nd Regimental Combat Team. These are Japanese American infantry unit. Who won 21 Medals of Honor. Okay, so there you go. So the point of you learning about these two groups, because both are minorities and both groups at home were facing discrimination, and yet they did, amazing. They had amazing accomplishments during the war to fight for freedom in America, while at home their people are being discriminated against. And we're going to go over that next week too. Okay, so there you go. 101st Airborne. That is the 1st Parachute Infantrymen of the U.S. Army. 1st Parachute Infantry. American. The British already had a group of guys that did this. They were called the SAS, but they are the 1st American Parachute Infantry. They also participated in D-Day. All right, and then the Navajo Code Talkers. They are Native Americans who helped the American victory, helped win the American victory in the Pacific by developing an unbreakable code. I know these are long answers, but they're super cool. Unbreakable code. You definitely need to look these guys up if you're very interested. I think there's a movie called Wind Talkers. I think that's what it's called. But I can direct you to some resources about the Navajo Code Talkers if you're interested. So email me if you're interested in any more of these. It's unfortunate we can't go into more detail, but we have a whole lot to cover. But if you are interested, definitely let me know. Or do some of your own research, that's cool too. But I can direct you to some good sources on this stuff. All right, so that covers those. All right, now we get to the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project is a code name that is for hiding the building of the atomic bomb, because you don't want your enemies to know that you're working on this. Now, the Germans and the Axis powers, they were working on a version of their own. So let's just jump right in. Very interesting. All right, now, it's very interesting about the Manhattan Project that it was actually, part of it was worked on in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. They have a nuclear lab there that they did it, and if you ever drive through Oak Ridge, you'll see it. But it's the Manhattan Project. It's the code for the American-led effort to develop the nuclear bomb. Sorry, y'all, this is a ton of information that we've been going through. So like I said, the Manhattan Project, code name for the atomic bomb. I'm gonna keep rocking and rolling because I'm thinking a million miles an hour about this stuff. Now, why did we use this thing? This is the most powerful weapon in history. This is opening a can of worms that nobody was prepared for, and it has caused an amazing amount of conflict. The atomic bomb sets us up for the rest of our school year because we're gonna be talking about the Cold War. This literally changed history. And the US government knew that this was going to happen, that it would change history. So they weren't sure if they should use this or not. So they have this strategy that we're creating this super weapon, but we're reluctant to use it because once they use it, somebody else is going to figure out how to make one too, okay? And it's going to be their enemy, the Soviet Union. Now, and I know we're friends, it's complicated, Cold War stuff, all right? I love World War II, so I'm just thinking a million miles an hour, all right? So, the U.S. is getting ready, remember the Battle of Okinawa, we're getting ready to invade Japan and finish the war there, okay? So they look at this war and they say, look at all the men that we've lost in the Pacific already, hopping island to island with our strategy, island hopping strategy. And they're looking at the invasion of Japan and they calculated it would cost over 1 million American lives that would die in battles in Japan, okay? So what they're saying is, do we invade Japan and cost 1 million American lives, or do we use our super weapon and open a terrible new can of worms and, kill lots and lots and lots of people and unleash the most powerful weapon the world has ever seen? So you see there's a major, major problem there, okay? And you see this is a hugely controversial topic even today. Atomic bombs, this is a very scary thing, all right? And the U.S. decides that they're going to use it because they decide, we want to save 1 million American lives. Now, the reason why I'm being a little dramatic about this is because you can't underestimate how powerful this weapon is. On August 6, 1945, the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. It was about 8:15 in the morning. When that bomb goes off, it literally unleashes pretty much the power of the sun. If you are in a certain radius, a couple of miles, you will be instantly vaporized. There are pictures and videos of when someone is blown up by an atomic bomb, if their shadow is on the wall here, the brightness of the flash of the bomb creates a permanent shadow. I don't know if I have a picture of it. I only have, I've seen it on video, but you can look that up, or I can send you a picture if you're interested. This is the most powerful weapon in human history, and it instantly killed 70,000 Japanese people. Now, that's not the worst part. The worst part is, that's a terrible part, and I'm not taking away from that, but the worst part is, afterwards, radiation poisoning sets in. The cloud of an atomic bomb, this thing, goes extremely high. And it's full of radioactive particles. And radiation gives people cancer, and it makes people sick, and it literally kills all the good cells and bacteria in your body. It kills all the bacteria in your body. It's really, really horrible. So you get sick, you get radiation sickness, and people would literally vomit up blood. And this lasts for years and years and years and years. Not only that, the radiation cloud gets in the actual clouds that are full of rain, and then acid rain falls, radiation rain, black rain is what they call it, falls on the city and gets more and more people sick. So this weapon, it cannot be underestimated how terrible this thing is, okay? Then, Japan still doesn't surrender because remember, Japan and Tojo, they operate under the code of Bushido, never surrender, okay? And finally, so the U.S. drops another bomb on Nagasaki, kills another 80,000 people, and then finally Japan, the people are freaking out. They're saying, Tojo, we're all going to die, and rightfully so, is them saying this. And so Tojo finally does have to surrender in 1945, August 14th, 1945. This is really terrible, and I'm going to show you some bad pictures, and you already saw them because I scrolled through. But I mean, just instantly takes out an entire city. Very terrible situation. Look up some stuff about this if you're interested more. I don't want to encourage you to be viewing images and things like this, but it's really important that you know this stuff because this is really scary stuff, and these bombs still exist. Yeah, it's a weird, scary thing. All right. Anyways, Manhattan Project. Man, it's terrible. Manhattan Project. That is the code name for development of atomic bomb or creation of the atomic bomb. Atomic bomb. And we're going to include some additional information that you need to know. It was worked on in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. They worked on this project in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. East Tennessee. Okay. What was President Truman's rationale for using the atomic bomb? He said it would cost over $1 million. If the U.S. invaded Japan. Good grief. I'm tired today. There we go. All right, let's see how that looks. Looks pretty good. Of atomic bomb is what it should say. Good grief. I'm having a hard time. There we go. I need some coffee. All right, there you have it. And I think we got 2 more standards. We got to talk about a couple more things. A lot of information. I would suggest watching this video a couple of times if you need to. All right, the Yalta and Potsdam Conferences. So what these are, very simple. Yalta and Potsdam Conferences, they're names of meetings, that's all it is, they're a couple of meetings between the most powerful leaders in the world of the Allied powers, the big 3. So the first one is the Yalta Conference. It's held in a city called Yalta, that's why it's called the Yalta Conference. And it's 3 guys that you've already met, you know a lot about. Churchill, who was Prime Minister of England, and friends with FDR, who is here in the middle. And then Stalin, so yes, that FDR and Stalin did know each other. And FDR actually quite liked Stalin. But anyways, they get together and they all meet, and then they discuss how we're going to run the end of the war, because this is 1945 when this happens. Remember, there had already been the big turning points in the war, and it was clear that the war in Europe was going to be won by the Allies. So they're going to talk about how we're going to divide up Germany, because it's going to be split in half, and we'll talk about that later. They discuss how to punish Germany, and then they're going to talk about something that Woodrow Wilson initially tried. He tried the League of Nations. They're going to form a United Nations, and that's another topic that we're going to have to discuss. So that's the Yalta Conference, 1945, February, between those 3. Now, another conference is held. It's called the Potsdam Conference, but by this time, FDR has died. So we get Truman. Also, Churchill has been voted out of office for a few different reasons, and they get a guy named Clement Attlee, so that's British. So I should actually write these down because it gets a little confusing. So we have the British guy here, British. President Truman, who is American. And then we get Stalin, who is Soviet Union or Russia. But you know Stalin already, you've already met him. So Truman and then Clement Attlee. And so what they figure out here is how they're going to actually, what they're literally going to do. So before, it was all theoretical. They're saying, what are some ideas you have for the end of the war? And this is where they discuss the specifics. They start with the Nazi war criminals. They're going to discuss how those are punished, the guys who ran the Holocaust camps. Germany's going to, they're not allowed to have a military after the war, and then it's going to be split up into 4 occupation zones occupied by different groups among these militaries here, okay? All right, so that's the Yalta and the Potsdam Conference. All right, next slide. What ideas were discussed at the Yalta and Potsdam Conference? You know what? Let's just put them together. How to rule Germany after the war. So they got to get Germany back on its feet because Hitler totally changed Germany, and so they're going to have to figure out who's going to step in, who's going to rule, what's it going to look like, how's it going to be divided. So how to rule Germany after the war. And punishment of Nazi war criminals, because they did discuss that one at the first meeting. There you go. Now, there's a whole lot more specifics about it, but that's the basics. That's what you need to know. Okay? All right. And last thing, the United Nations. Don't need that. And there's a guy you need to know. His name is Cordell Hull. So what it is, the United Nations, it's just a group of nations who are a big, it's a formal alliance of, who had 51 countries right at the beginning. Now it has 193 countries. Now the UN is different than a military organization. It's more of a peacetime thing. And so what they do is they go into countries who need help to kind of help them out. The UN works in a lot of countries in Africa and a lot of poor countries around the world. And what they do is they just try to make peace there. They try to offer solutions to the people. They may use some military force there, but it's not their main objective. Their main objective is to help out people who need help. So it's kind of an effort to try to prevent another Holocaust, more or less. They provide medical assistance and food to people who have emergencies, and then humanitarian, basically, like I said, peace and humanitarian support for people around the world, okay? So it's not really, it's not so much about having a military alliance, it's just more about preventing another terrible, terrible thing such as World War II and the Holocaust from happening again, okay? There's some of their logos and things and some of the things that they're into. Now, there's a guy from Tennessee that the state government wants you to know. His name is Cordell Hull, and he's the U.S. Secretary of State under FDR, and he eventually wins the Nobel Peace Prize after the UN is created. So really good guy, very famous Tennessean. There's a lot of stuff in Tennessee named after him, so there you go. That's Cordell Hull. All right? All right. So what are some purposes or goals of the United Nations? Explore options for peace. Globally. Peace. Globally. Okay. And humanitarian support for people around the world. And then who is Cordell Hull? The Tennessean who helped found the United Nations. Good grief. All right, so there you have it. Woo! That was a lot of information. I got a little jumbled up there in the middle because of all the stuff that we had gone over, and my mind is just worn out after all that. So, guys, hope you got most of that information. You'll probably need to watch this one again because it is a lot of names, a lot of vocabulary. We went through a whole lot of questions. Make sure to download the PowerPoint, visit my website and get it. Make sure to download the notes because all the information is there. Also, what we did in this video is just kind of touch on the surface of a lot of this stuff because we don't have a ton of time. I don't want to make a 20-hour video for you to watch over the week because you probably would get so tired of hearing me talk. But we just touched on the surface of a lot of this stuff. So if you're interested, email me and I can direct you to some really good resources on this stuff. And yeah, so you got a little taste of World War II there. Please remember to download the notes like I said already, and if you need any help, please email me, and hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye!